Greetings, fellow painters! Today we're going to experiment with creating our own speed paints for batch painting miniatures in the Slapchop style. I'm going to discuss specific guidelines that I use when creating my own speed paint colors, as well as the mediums that I prefer to use. And even though I'm demonstrating this while painting up some specialists for the Marvel Zombies board game, you'll be able to apply these ideas to any miniature that you paint. Welcome to Trehane Miniatures. While I prepare these miniatures for speed painting, we'll cover some basics. I essentially use just two mediums when creating my speed paints. I use transparent inks and a gloss glazing medium. I don't use surfactants like Airbrush Flow Improver in these paints because I want them to have a lot of body like speed paints, so I have more control over where they flow. When buying packaged inks, it can be tricky to determine the transparency of each ink without examining each and every bottle itself. Sometimes, if all inks in a set are transparent, it will be labeled transparent on the outside of the packaging. Now, when Liquitex uses the term transparent, it's not referring to some modern US families, it's strictly referring to the opacity of their inks. However, if inks of different opacities are packaged together, there is usually absolutely no indication on the outside packaging what the opacity of each ink is. For example, in this muted ink set, all of the inks are transparent with the exception of the titanium white, which is opaque. There is nothing on the outside packaging to indicate this. On the essential ink set, only the blue ink is opaque, while the red and yellows are both transparent. Again, there is nothing on the outside packaging to indicate this. So you'll rely on the opacity indicator on the bottle itself to determine its transparency. Liquitex and Daler Rowney both use the same opacity icon to indicate how transparent their paints are. What we're looking at here is the small square box under the color identifier number. There are three different opacities. A completely black box indicates that the ink is opaque. A half black, half white box indicates a semi-transparent ink. And a completely white box is going to be a transparent ink. I primarily use transparent inks when creating my own speed paints. Before we get into mixing up our own paints, I'll quickly go over my dry brush recipe for speed painting, or you can skip straight to mixing up some of your own colors using the timestamp down below. For the white dry brush, I use a proprietary mix of Liquitex Basic Titanium White acrylic paint and Liquitex Titanium White ink. The Titanium White Basics acrylic paint provides body to the mix and a nice creamy consistency, while the ink, being an opaque ink, boosts the pigment of the mix. I'm applying this to a couple of test models first to determine how heavy I want to apply the dry brush, so I do one with a heavy dry brush and the other with a bit lighter approach. Since we're experimenting with creating speed paints and I want to determine how they perform as speed paints, I decided to go with a very heavy dry brush. Leaving too much shadow primer visible is kind of a cheat to add contrast to the mini without the speed paints having to do the work. Plus, I'm planning to leave the white dry brush as the only paint for the white components of the miniature. I've also decided to do a little side-by-side comparison between the white dry brush mixture and Monument Hobbies Bold Titanium White, which is widely regarded as being one of the finest titanium white miniature paints available. I'm going to dry brush all of the male specialists with the Liquitex acrylic paint and ink mix, and I'll dry brush all of the female specialists with the Monument Hobbies Bold Titanium White. As expected, the Liquitex blend is producing smooth results. Now I'll dry brush the female specialist with Bold Titanium White. To be honest, I've heard so much hype about this paint that I was expecting pure magic from it. The first thing that I notice is that it goes on very vibrant and very smooth. Sweet. But as it dries, I notice it returns almost completely to the gray primer color. So I just keep applying the dry brush layers and I keep adding paint to my palette, and the end result is a very smooth and vibrant white finish. The biggest difference between the two paints is that it took me a little over 12 minutes to dry brush the 7 miniatures with the Liquitex blend, but it took me a little over 23 minutes to accomplish the same thing with the Bold Titanium White Pro Acryl. So, from a purely speed painting perspective, I would prefer the Liquitex mix for dry brushing. However, if you're trying to accomplish a more high-level dry brush, Slapchop style, something like what Artist Opus achieves, then I think Bold Titanium White Pro Acryl would be your better choice. The fact that it dries more translucent and requires more layers means that you could achieve a smoother transition from your shadow colors up to your brightest highlights by applying gradually lighter dry brush steps. Visually, the end result here is the same for me, so I'll take the speedy approach. Plus, if I haven't mentioned it yet, I kinda despise batch painting and dry brushing. This definitely is not my forte. Alright, let's mix up some effing speed paints. We know that we're using transparent inks and gloss glazing medium. There are two guidelines that I follow when creating speed paints. I use equal parts glazing medium and transparent ink, and I always mix the color much darker than I want it to look. The translucent nature of speed paints when painted over white will make them look much lighter on the model than they do in the pot. For the first color, I'm actually deviating a bit from these guidelines by mixing in glazing medium at half the amount of the total ink volume. I'm using 6 drops of muted gray transparent ink, 3 drops of muted turquoise transparent ink, and 1 drop of black opaque ink for a total of 10 drops of ink. To that, I'm adding only 5 drops of glazing medium. This is because I want the Specialist bodysuit to be very dark, bluish-black color without super bright highlights, kind of like the game art. And I'm loving this color. This is the color that got me started mixing my own speed colors when I painted the Trooper miniatures for this game. I do have this starter set of Speed Paint 2.0, but nothing was close to this dark bluish-black color. I could use the starter set for the rest of the colors, but I decided to try my hand at mixing my own. I think that the yellow and tan flesh color that I create outperform the speed paints that I have, but I'll let you be the judge of that. This dark blue flows super easy with lots of control, and you can even push it up into the recesses so you don't paint outside the lines. The hardest part about these Specialist miniatures is all of the little white straps and pouches that I have to carefully paint around. But much like speed paints, this mix with the glazing medium slows down the drying of the paints, so any errant paint strokes are easily mopped up with a clean, damp brush. I fully intended to leave the white as is, which is perfectly adequate with the gray shadows, but I decided later to challenge myself and create a white speed paint. I believe that the white was one of the most heavily criticized colors for the first speed paint line, but I haven't tried it myself. You may be tempted to use matte glazing medium instead of the gloss glazing medium, but the matte definitely won't flow as well over the highlights, which is probably why some people use a flow improver in their DIY speed paints and contrast paints. You can always hit this with a matte varnish when you're all done. I'm wrapping up the dark blue by using it to paint the glasses as well. And here's where it gets fun. I'm whipping up a yellow for the Specialist blonde hair. I'm adding 4 drops of raw sienna transparent ink, 2 drops of cadmium yellow transparent ink, and 1 drop of burnt sienna transparent ink. To this I'm adding 7 drops of glazing medium. And yes, this makes yellow. When mixing your own speed paint colors, think of the color that you want the shadows to be. If there's only one thing that you take away from this video, this should be it. Mix the paint to the darkness of the shadow color. As the paint flows over the raised white areas of the Mini, it will appear much lighter there. Where it settles into the recesses is where it will reflect the color that you've mixed on your palette. I usually have twice the shadow color as what I would consider the midtone color. So for example here, I have 4 drops of the dark raw sienna and 2 drops of the cadmium yellow, which I would consider the midtone. And then I usually add 1 drop of a darker, deeper shadow color, which in this case is the burnt sienna. Likewise, on the bodysuit, I had 3 drops of turquoise, which I consider the midtone, 6 drops of gray for the shadow, and 1 drop of the darker color, which was black. Make it dark. Use a test mini if you have doubts. Next up, we're going to create a light flesh tone, but I do want it to be darker than the hair. I start with the blonde hair recipe and add 2 additional drops of burnt sienna transparent ink, 1 drop of burnt umber transparent ink, and 3 additional drops of glazing medium. So the final mix contains 2 drops cadmium yellow, 4 drops raw sienna, 3 drops burnt sienna, and 1 drop burnt umber, and 10 drops glazing medium. It should look like this when it's all mixed together. After first trying this out on a test model to see how it performs, I get to work painting this on all of the Specialists. I think that this skin color looks pretty fantastic, and it behaves basically like you'd expect any speed paint to behave. I'd never claim that these home-brewed paints replace official speed paints, but if you enjoy the creative process and the versatility of creating your own speed paint colors, then this is definitely a worthwhile experiment. I have decided to paint all of the male and female Specialists with identical hair and skin colors. I painted all of the Troopers for this game with dark hair and dark flesh, so I'm going to paint all of the Specialists with light hair and light flesh. The clothing for the Troopers and Specialists is identical, so painting their hair and skin specific to each unit type will help differentiate them on the table. I'm creating a very basic black speed paint with equal parts opaque black ink and glazing medium. There isn't much special about this. This isn't a very translucent mix, but it will still allow some of the highlights to show through, as you can see on the hair of this test model. I chose to go with a more opaque finish to the black because it is just going to be applied to a few accent pieces without any real texture, such as the eyeglass strap and earpiece. If I were painting something more significant, such as a garment, I would add more glazing medium to the black ink and perhaps some muted gray as well to achieve a more dynamic result. And speak of the devil, I realize that I have completely overlooked the knee pads, so I'm going to create a lighter concoction now by adding muted gray and more glazing medium to the black. I'm going to use this to paint the baton and knee pads. This will allow a little more highlight to show through on the knee pads. Later, the top of the baton will receive a white highlight followed by a light blue glaze to simulate the electric effect found in the character art. We'll do another no-frill speed paint by simply mixing equal parts muted violet, translucent ink, and glazing medium. This really demonstrates how simple and effective creating your own speed paints can be. And while this isn't quite as rewarding as actually mixing your own unique colors, it does get the job done. And now I'm going to add a couple of little details with standard acrylic paints by highlighting the visor and baton with titanium white. Then I'll use electric blue Vallejo paint to glaze over those highlights. And I'll give all of the badges a quick gold dry brush. The final speed paint that I'm going to attempt to make is a white speed paint. I'm using equal parts Vallejo gray wash and glazing medium. I was making this just to use on the test minis, but I liked the result so much that I decided to put it on the specialist as well. It's very subtle in color, but it does a great job of knocking down that chalkiness of the white dry brush, and the light gray settling into the recesses and crevices adds a nice light shade to the white boots and backpack. I hope you enjoyed this little experiment in crafting your own speed paint colors. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to join our growing community of painters.